Well, we'll go ahead and get started. So, we're continuing. Now we're going to continue talking about the Trungpa's count of the 5 skandhas, which is in this book, The Glimpses of Abhidharma. And so we're getting Abhidharma, and we're getting Trungpa. And Trungpa's contribution to Abhidharma, which is not insignificant, is that he gives the whole thing a very psychological, it is a psychological system to begin with, but he sort of brings it contemporaneous with our understanding of sort of Western psychology. And he develops this idea of the ego and sort of the a structure of ego. And the structure of ego is that it's built with these 5 basic components called heaps or skandhas, and they are form, feeling, perception, concept, and consciousness. And these component mental activities are what ego uses to give itself a sense of solidity. And the first one, as we talked about, that we covered it earlier, was form. And form is just our direct sensing of objects and smells, sounds, tastes, and so forth out in the world. And so the form is both the form of our own physical senses and what they reveal to us. And when that process happens, which is very direct and very clear and clean, actually, then feeling arises as we become, once we're aware of certain forms, even almost unconsciously, certainly unconsciously for almost everyone, we have some sort of feeling. So if it's flowers or, a cute dog, you have a warm feeling toward or a pleasant feeling toward something. If it's a noisy truck barreling down on you, you have an unpleasant feeling. Or if it's some kind of, odor of something, not pleasant in the wrong place, then that's an unpleasant. So we're always having some kind of feeling, positive or negative, towards those objects that we sensed. So now we're going to come to perception. And basically, in Trungpa's account of the skandhas here, perception is basically tuning into the details. Now you might say, well, did it have the form and to have the senses? That was perception. And in a way it is. But here the perception is a sort of second order perception. Once at first there's just, we walk into a room, there's a lot of objects, we feel certain ways towards certain things, and then we zero in on what interests us. And this is the kind of perception, this zeroing into the details, looking at something closer, putting our attention onto something, especially that idea of putting our attention onto something, that's perception. So we get further in to the object. And that, as he's going to talk about, is a further solidifying of this kind of open situation in which essentially there's space and sensual display of sensual ornament or sense ornament. But here, we freeze that space and we create solid objects that we then relate to in terms of feeling, in terms of where we put our attention, in terms of digging into them. And all of that further gives us this sort of sense of solidity to ego. So that's the idea. And then beyond perception, just to a little bit of plot spoiler here. There's conception and consciousness, and not only are we going to look into the details, but as we put our attention on things, we're going to fold them into our general narrative about who we are and what the world is. And as we fold this, things, objects of interest into our narrative, then with that narrative then becomes even stronger kind of solidification. And finally, with our narrative in line, our perceptions, our feelings, and our sense recognition, we're ready to go on stage and take our show on the road, relating to all of this and to others. And that's sort of the fifth skandha, or consciousness. Consciousness is when, we're actually reacting and engaging the thing as a whole at that point. So that's the structure of ego as Trungpa outlines it. It's worth noting that Trungpa interestingly has a strongly pejorative take on ego. Ego is always, for Trungpa, ego is stupid and fearful and greedy, and sort of it's like the whole idea of the self, particularly the idea of the ego, the individual self, is always something that's kind of gumming up the works. And in a way that's generally the Buddhist attitude, but he lays it on rather strongly that way. It's interesting to note that when Freud, who coined the term that Trungpa is using here in English, the term which became translated in English as ego, Freud's ego is not at all that sort of fearful, greedy, self-solidifying, fake entity that Trungpa would have it. Ego for Freud is a mediator. He's trying to actually keep us, on track between the forces of our id, which are these, sensual forces, like wanting just to kind of eat and rut and sleep, and kind of animal level forces sweeping through us. And then our superconscious, which is all the conditioning and parental commands and teacher commands and societal commands and social media commands that we, keep us in check so that we don't run as wild as animals. And ego is trying to kind of, get a balance there. So between these two competing drivers, and that's kind of his role. So an ego in the Freudian sense is kind of, again, it's sort of just a mental faculty that sort of arises. And I think in the way that they're both similar, and you don't necessarily have to go with one or the other, but it's something that just arises as needed. So in a sense, it's not that we don't have the sense of self sometimes. Every so often I start to reflect on whether or not there is a self, and I always find one, so to speak. But then a few minutes later, I've forgotten all about it. So the problem is that you couldn't actually pinpoint some part of your mind that functions in that kind of mediating way. It's definitely a functional mind, just like our analytical or our ability to concentrate, our functions of mind. It's just that all functions of mind are somewhat, they come and they go. And our problem isn't so much that we have a sense of self. I think, in fact, a minimal sense of self in the phrase self-awareness is considered to be a positive thing. Self-awareness is the idea that we're aware of our emotions, we're aware of our thoughts, we're aware of our presence, and we're aware of our impact on other people and how we're being received by other people. And if all that is quite helpful in terms of awareness, the problem comes in when we try to manipulate the self or try to embellish the self or, or develop, all kinds of neurotic, mental um, patterns related to the self. So that's a general introduction. We're going to read through Trungpa's chapter here on perception, and then we'll read a little bit about from the questions and answers, because Trungpa, and what's great about reading this is that he gets bored with the Abhidharma pretty quickly, and he sort of drifts on to talking about Tantra and Dzogchen, so that's quite fun. So we'll get to that later on. So this is perception, and Trungpa writes, feelings relating to process consist of extremes, of polarities, dichotomies. In other words, one cannot develop feelings unless there are two extremes of some kind. Following from that, because of having some sense of taking sides with this extreme as opposed to that extreme, the subtleties of feeling have a solid grasping quality in dealing with the projection of the world outside, rather than responding purely and directly. It is like a personal relationship with somebody which is based solely on temperamental reactions. As we know, there has to be something more than that, otherwise the relationship will not last very long. But feeling is like that. Feelings have a bouncy quality of jumping from one extreme to another. Having already the basic qualities of form, one starts to relate, to insert oneself into certain situations, into the two extremes of good and bad, pain and pleasure, body and mind, and so on. It is like in rock climbing when you start to insert a metal peg. That is the feeling. But to continue climbing, you have to have a rope running through that peg. The rope that you have to have running through that peg is perception, the third skandha. Perception is necessary so that the two extremes have something continuing underneath as a common link, a common thread that runs between happiness and sadness of body and mind. So here the idea is that what we're paying attention to in a deeper way, where we're taking an interest in, that becomes the thread that holds feelings together, because we tend to be interested in things that we have some feeling toward one way or the other. That's what's brought to our attention. So feeling is like presents us the menu, and then perception is when we kind of zero in on what it is we're interested in pursuing. Trungpa goes on to say, perception is based on that which is manifested by form and feeling, and that which is not manifested by them. These are two basic qualities in perception. In the first case, something is manifested via the six sense organs. You perceive something and you relate to it. You hold on to certain senses and their perceptions, and then from these you relate with that content. That is the first touching and feeling process. Feeling is like radiation radiating out. With that radiating, perception takes place as the radiation begins to function and to the definite details of that and this. So that's this idea of perception, is of getting into the details. And you're going to see that Trungpa has this idea of manifest perception and unmanifest perception. Manifest perception is just getting into the details of what's actually there. And then unmanifest perception is sort of what we would call imagination. It's thinking about the stuff that's not there and which you would like to be there. We'll get to that in a minute. But you have to, it's interesting to meditate or reflect on how perception anchors our world. How what we pay attention to is what we take for real. How what we pay, where we put our mind is creating what we are uh, mind creates matter. It creates the matter of our world because the mind matter that we focus on is what's going to be remembered. It's going to be what we're processing, and all the matter out there, all the form out there that we're not putting our mind on, it is not is as if it weren't even there. So our world is very selectively projected world because of our interest and our attention and what we've decided to perceive in a more deep way is actually putting our world together piece by piece. Um, it's kind of like a layering thing, you've got these different layers, and the layers get more layers, then things start to seem as if they're actuality. Trungpa goes on. In this case, feeling is not quite our ordinary notion of feeling. It's not the feelings we take so seriously as, for instance, when we say, he hurt my feelings. That kind of feeling we take seriously belongs to the 4th and 5th skandhas. In other words, it's part of our conceptual and social life. Of concept and consciousness. Here, in the case of the 2nd skandha of feeling, it is the immediate, impulsive type of feeling of jumping to certain conclusions and trying to attach oneself to them. Perception could be called another type of feeling, the deepened feeling of experiencing that which is manifest and that which is non-manifest in terms of the solid bodily situation. You see, the whole idea of the manifested and the non-manifested here comes from freezing space in our way of dealing with situations. Primordial consciousness flashes out, the unconscious flashes out, which creates tremendous open space. So that's Trungpa's view. The world originally is this primordial consciousness, and out of that consciousness there's these flashings and all kinds of dynamic energy. And it's all happening, all this dynamic energy is dancing within open space. But then, within that dance, because of dancing too fast, because of tripping, falling, whatever, ignorance and energy develop. And immediately then he says, when ego begins to take up its position through the action of the skandhas, there is a naturally automatic tendency to relate to the open space as overcrowded, i.e. frozen. Ego tries to possess that open space, that primarily awakened state, by overcrowding it with form. But it can't overcrowd it with a lot of stuff because there isn't enough stuff at that point. Ego is not yet fully developed with all its resources of imagination. It is still the first impulsive situation of ego's development, so in order to crowd that space, one tries to freeze the whole space into a solid block. It's like water freezing into ice. The space itself is regarded as a solid thing related to us, related to ego. In other words, the principle of shunyata and nothingness, emptiness and openness, the awake state, is automatically in itself regarded as a sleep state, as overcrowded space. That kind of freezing of the space starts at the level of form, continues with feeling, and now manifests fully with perception. Perception, in the sense of the 3rd skandha, cannot exist without solidness, without solidifying. That is the manifestation aspect. The non-manifestation aspect is the aspect of annihilation, giving up all hope and retaining any kind of ground which is based on fear. The first is hope, the second fear. The manifestation, the physical manifestation, the solidified content of perception is based on hope, and the second aspect, non-manifestation, is based on despair. That works by when there is no hope of maintaining solid ground anymore, making that position, just despair, into a solid ground. So Trungpa is going to go into an analysis here, which is a little hard to understand because it's not quite coherent. But there are 5 aspects to perception, and the first aspect is manifest perception, which is actually what we experience and are kind of paying more attention to or not. And then there's the non-manifest perception, which is what could be there, or now he's talking about in terms of basically a fear of things not being solid. And then he goes on to a couple more aspects. He says a third and fourth aspect of perception, after manifestation and non-manifestation, are involved with criteria again. The criteria here concern how much area the grasping of perceptions can cover. The ego is extending its territory as far as it can, that is, trying to label and define as much as it can. Automatically, the notions of big and small, greater and lesser develop. Even the notion of smaller can help define more ground, so these polarities develop. So, the third aspect of perception in this list, which I'm not sure where it comes from, is big, and the fourth aspect is small. So there's a perception of yeah, I don't. Create more reality. We still, which is what Trump is calling solidifying our world. And that sense of, what's important, what's not important, how important is this, what's interesting, what's worth pursuing, what's not worth pursuing, all those kinds of mental choices we make almost unconsciously, usually unconsciously, that help direct our attention is part of the deeper aspect of perception. And then after he gets to this whole idea of perception based on discrimination and deepening interest and extending solidifying our territory more, he then brings up a very interesting point. It's called the fifth aspect of perception. And he says, there's a fifth aspect of perception, which is absolute nothingness. Absolute nothingness in this case could be said to be a spark of intelligence coming through, connected with the primordial ground. There is a dispute on that subject between scholars of two schools of thought. One school said there was a spark of intelligence coming through. The other said it was still confusion, that there could be no question of awareness or intelligence in the skandhas. At this stage of perception, there could be the hope of freeing oneself at all. There could be no hope of freeing oneself at all. But in my view, and as I have been taught, Trungpa says, there is a possibility of a complete change in one's perception, one complete change in one's perspective in relation to perceptions. An experience of absolute nothingness means giving up even hope itself or fear itself, and no longer perceiving in terms of grasping or clinging on to something. In that experience, you're just trying to be brave enough to let go of your grasping a little, just to feel around openly a bit in the local areas, float around a little bit. So that aspect of perception means beginning to be pretty brave. That sort of bravery comes from Tathagarbha, Buddha nature, the basic intelligence. It is the basic intelligence which begins to show this bravery. On the whole, any notion of exploring or taking a chance or relating with one's ego and projections is regarded as inspired by the enlightened mind. That is because you are not trying to hold on to continue something, to prove something, but you are looking at other possibilities. That in itself is a very brave attitude and a very spacious one, because your mind is completely charged with curiosity and interest in space and questions. It's a sort of wandering process and is very hopeful and very positive in this particular connection. This absolute nothingness is the last stage of the development of perception. Well, apparently at some point, as we build the world of ego on form, on feeling, and perception, we're gonna, get to the narrative, and then we're gonna get to the stage. Here at the level of perception, there already is starting to be some cracks in this whole wall or solidity, solid space that ego is trying to create. And one of the cracks happens in perception itself, in that as we go further into things, we actually discover that that they're empty. And you have to just reflect on your own life, how many different things you became very interested in, and then at some point that interest sort of just dies off. You don't have it, you lose interest in something that was at once, and it looked like it had something there. It had something that intrigued you, that you felt could be give you something, make you feel better, or occupy you, or whatever. But at some point, it kind of wears itself out. And that, which is actually uncomfortable for ego, is good for our deeper Buddha nature, because that's the absolute, that space breaking through this whole cocoon that ego is trying to spin with the skandhas. So, right at the level of our perceptions, we can't glue that cocoon tight, because the light is coming through, the space is coming through, air is coming through, and that's what we experience this kind of letting go of the project of trying to create a solid world, and we just start to play with what's in front of us. We take a little bit more relaxed attitude towards it. So that's the idea there, where perception eventually shows us that things can't satisfy us in the way we thought they could. So to finish the chapter talk, Trungpa says, absolute nothingness is the last stage of the development of perception. On the whole, the relationship between perception and the previous skandhas is that form creates the ego and ignorance in basic things, and feeding brings the spiky quality of sharpness within that of something trying to maintain itself. The perception comes as feeling. The perception comes as extending ego's territory, trying to define its position even much more. There is in perception a lot of referring back to the central headquarter of ego, and then extending and exploring further and further, always in relation back to it. The establishment of territory in relation to a central reference point seems to be the general pattern of the development of ego. So any questions about the perception of the 5 skandhas? We'll stop here and any questions or comments, and then we'll continue with a slightly different direction.
Just a brief comment that I had put together that table from this book. It's just a manual of key Buddhist terms, and under perception it gives 3 aspects, which is small, extensive, and limitless. So he had 5. I wonder if limitless is the same as the absolute nothingness. It seems to be.
There might be some categorization that the Tibetans had that Trump has been taught, that he's going from. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen that before, but. I mean, there's all sorts of ways you could divide up perception. I mean, when I talk about foreground and background, for example, that each moment was happening around us, we're sort of on the stage as an actor, and the actor's doing something, even if we're meditating or reading a book or sleeping or eating or walking or driving a car or working or whatever, sitting in front of the computers. That those activities that we're engaged in, that moment to moment, is our foreground of our experience. But all the time that we're engaged in the foreground, where the part in the theater the spotlight's put on, there's also a background. There's a background that's physical, that's the room that we're in, the larger locale that we're in, the place we occupy in space-time, so to speak. But there's also a background in terms of the energies. That there's energies that are engaged in what's happening, but then there's sort of latent energies that are present as well. And also in the background, there's this kind of limitlessness as well. So if I was going to riff off the idea of small, big, and limitless, I would say small is what's in front of us. That's our foreground. That's the details that we're concerned with at the moment. Large is that background, which all the stuff that's kind of latent and not engaged, but is actually still present. And then limitless as the absolute or the empty quality that pervades everything. So, actually, somebody, this is 1975, so you can see back then how sharp we were. Somebody in the audience for this talk asked a very astute question of, is it possible to continue to exist without this process? The process of skandha formation, of ego formation. Is it possible to continue to exist without this process? It seems if that would stop, I would be in great danger if I didn't have an ego or didn't have my skandhas working in that way. And Trungpa has an interesting answer here. He says, well, that is what you think. There are people who have managed to do without it, though. After all this information about this pattern of the five skandhas comes from the point of view of those who have seen it from above, from an aerial view. It is not necessary to go through these complicated patterns of skandhas. It would be extremely simple not to go through them anymore. You do not have to keep giving birth to the whole process. You can just perceive and go along with that perception whenever it arises. Question: is that kind of perception you were just talking about outside the ego's confines? Rinpoche: well, that becomes inspiration. Outside of ego, perception becomes inspiration. But that is getting into the tantric level, which may be too difficult to understand. So, he says, yeah, you don't have to do that. You can have the mental functions without ego, the appropriation of them to create a sense of solidity. For example, perception, again, is simply that mental function of paying closer attention to things, right? So paying closer attention to things, if they're because of the intrinsic nature of the thing itself, its qualities, its a sense of wonder, or whatever, just a sense of appreciation, it creates an open space within perception so that our perception becomes inspirational and not part of this kind of ego building. So there's an enlightened way to perceive things, and that's to see them through an eye of appreciative, uh, um, just an eye of appreciative experience. That's not at all, and that's what he talks about as tantric. They were engaging things and appreciating them, seeing them as part of the sacred world, seeing them as being special, um, and not as something that we can use to build ourselves up. So the person asks, inspiration for what? Rinpoche says, for itself, just that. Question. It seems that there are hints of tantric teaching in all of this. Rinpoche, of course, yes. If it were without connection to the earlier teachings, Tantra would be a solitary planet. Actually, some of the details of tantric iconography are developed from Abhidharma. Different colors and feelings of this particular consciousness, that particular emotion, are manifested in a particular deity wearing such and such a costume of certain particular colors, holding certain particular scepters in his hand. Though these tales are very closely connected with the individualities of particular psychological processes. Question. If you understand the Abhidharma really clearly, you can get into Tantra then. Rinpoche. Yes, that is what happens. Actually, a great deal of the tantric symbolism, the mandala, for example, is based on the terminology of the Abhidharma. It runs right through. The Abhidharma is a way of seeing the psychology that it describes as not just a lump sum, a theoretical generality. There is individuality in every aspect of human emotion, human psychology. It is very rich. Each aspect of mind has its own individual flavor, and as you go on further and further, deeper and deeper, you begin to see these individual aspects as really living forces. At that point, you also lose ego because you no longer have to label experience as one big lump of me or mine or I anymore. That has become useless or absurd. So in Trungpa's view of ego again, ego is unnecessary. We have these mental functions, they function on their own, they're fine on their own. Just, you don't have to have a meta function, which is ego, controlling all the other functions, that they're already naturally in harmony and naturally pure and present, so to speak. So that's why you can get rid of the ego and just perceive things directly as they are. And then the questioner asks, does one identify then with the details? Is there a technique of identification happening? Well, Rinpoche says, if you identify with all these details going on in a personal experience, that is very much a shortcut. You don't have to look for outside answers because the answers are there already. It happens on a personal level. Question, what is the process when you say identify with something? Say I'm sawing a piece of wood and I remember to identify with that. Is it something like putting my mind on my hand? How does this fit in with the skandhas? Is that like connecting the sixth or seventh or the eighth type of consciousness with the visual consciousness? Good grief. Rinpoche, you're quite right to raise that question. It's quite dangerous actually when we talk about identifying. You can identify outwardly with things as they are, so there is no center but just fringe everywhere. Expansion everywhere. Or you can identify inwardly. That is, you can identify with things that are happening in yourself as a solid entity. Identification should be open identification, centralist identification, in other words, without a watcher. That is the whole point. If there is no watcher, then identification becomes real identification, really making a connection with things as they are. Whereas if you identify inwardly, then you're identifying in accordance with some concept, in accordance with your own categories. Question. Identifying inwardly would be connecting your mind with the thing. With a solidified notion. Yes, that is what we call materialism, spiritual or psychological materialism. Question, this is the other kind. Identifying outwardly is just being aware of what's happening. Well, you're not watching your body and your physical motion as thawing wood, but you just become one with the wood itself. You do not watch yourself being identified, but you become completely one with the action or object of what you are doing. So, identifying is the wrong word here. You don't really. What Rinpoche wants to do is to drop all of that. Any kind of identification, inwardly, outwardly, any kind of elaboration in this Ochen sense, and just do what you're doing completely and fully engaging in the action of the moment. So I think that's the. There's a couple questions at the end here that are part of this chapter that are pretty good. Somebody asked him, could you say something about pure pleasure and pure pain isolated into themselves? How can they exist outside of body or mind? And Rinpoche says, they cannot exist outside the actual body and the actual mind, but they can exist outside our version of the body and our version of mind. That is the most difficult thing of all. We say body, we say mind, but we have our own interpretation of them, our own concept of them, which constantly separates us from the reality of body and mind, the bodiness, the mindness, the thingness of things as they are. This thingness of things as they are is what is called emptiness, shunyata, the actual isness quality of things. Things could be without us. They can remain pure and perfect as they are. But we put our own version over them, and we then amalgamate them all together. It is like dressing up as dolls. We have naked bodies, and then we put on military costumes or monk's robes or ordinary tie and suit. We dress them up, and then suddenly we find that they are alive, and we try to run away from them because they begin to chase us. We end up being haunted by our own desires and perceptions because we put so much onto them. Finally, our own creation becomes destructive to us. So what the idea is here is that perception is always conditioned, that we're not getting clean perception in terms of the ego, in terms of the 5 skandhas. In that structure of things, our perception is already conditioned, is conditioned by our ignorance, the ignorance that froze space to begin with, the ignorance that creates solidity to begin with, the ignorance that's trying to establish itself as something rather than nothing. That ignorance is already clouded our perception so that we're not seeing anything as it really is. We're not seeing our body as it is. We're not seeing our mind as it is. We're not seeing other people as they are, or things as they are, or events as they are. Anything, everything is completely fabricated. And we've, through this whole process of layering in Skandha formation, we created this kind of world and forces, and they chase us around. It's kind of like the Jewish story of the golem, that these magicians create this human being out of clay in imitation of the creator. But once this clay creature gets going, he just goes off on his own and doesn't pay any attention to his creator, and it becomes quite a problem. And that's exactly here, is our own perceptions, our fake perceptions, if you will, are creating a problem because they're coming back to haunt us and to chase us about. I don't know so much of it as our perceptions that haunt us. To me, that seems more characteristic of our conceptions. The next skandha. When we get to conception, we start having ideas about things, not simply perceiving them in detail, but working them into our story, our life story. Then that definitely gets on. It's just like every day you get up and you think of what you have to do, and the things that we know we have to do are haunting us because we have to, how am I going to handle this? How am I going to handle that? I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. Or I'm anticipating this, So all kinds of feelings and emotions are generated just by the whole conceptualized world that we've created. And someone asked Rinpoche, just to finish this up here, I really didn't understand what you said about freezing space. And Rinpoche says, the basic ground is open ground, but you do not want to accept that. You want to solidify it to make it tangible, safe ground to walk on. So by freezing space, I mean solidifying that open space. There could be the experience of pain and pleasure as negative pain and pleasure without any problem, fixing them in relationship to anything. We do not have to conquer our projections in our mind at all. We do not have to control anything. Things as they are can remain independent. Once situations are left open and fresh and naked, the experiences can become very flowing, real, and living. Question: where do pure pain and pleasure come from in this pure open situation? Rinpoche: well, they manifest by themselves. They are not dependent on anything. That is the whole point. We do not have to have a chain reaction process. Each pain and pleasure can come as an independent package deal. The whole problem arises from relating with experiences to something other than just what it is. One of the things about it just being what it is that it's temporal, and it's going to be gone in a second. But we solidify it by not letting it disappear naturally. We hold on to it, in other words. So then it has to be maintained or controlled. If you have extreme spiritual pleasure, there's the possibility of losing it, or it's dying because you're trying to maintain it. But really, you do not have to maintain it. It is its own independent, autonomous, self-sufficient experience. Therefore, in the tantric iconography, pain and pleasure and all these experiences is described as divinities, independent persons dancing on the lotus seats. They are independent beings that are completely not being manipulated by remote control. So the natural world is the world of spontaneous energies, unfrozen, and that's the world that we're wanting to allow to happen. And the way we allow that to happen is simply by relaxing, by not pushing our narrative and our projections onto things. we just got a couple different books on mindfulness that are part of a teaching series, and so it's in talking about mindfulness, of course, they talk about how the basic idea of mindfulness is just to experience things without having any interpretation of them, to see things and not react to them one way or the other, to just let them be. So that whole process of letting things be is inherent in the simplest Buddhist practice of mindfulness, which is, of course, developed through meditation. In meditation, everything comes up as we're sitting there. Our thoughts come up, our anxieties come up, our plans come up, our fears, our hopes. The whole soup bowl stew of our minds comes up bit by bit to the surface, and we see it and we let it go. And the whole thing, as they talk about the meditation of mindfulness, but it also works well with what Rinpoche is saying here, is that we just have to develop that neutral attitude towards everything, so that we get some space around the events and situations in our life.
I find interesting that line. I think he called it, where he said the link between body and mind. Perception is like the link between body and mind. And so it's almost like perception's almost the Sambhogakaya type sort of idea. And that like body would be like Nirmanakaya and mind would be like Dharmakaya.
Well, interesting. First, the form, feeling, and perception, the first three skandhas. I think that they're basic mental functions. There are sense function, there are affective function, how we feel about things, and there are perception, recognition, and so those are always going to be with us. And in fact, those are present in the Sambhogakaya. Now, the Sambhogakaya is this subtle heavenly world that we can't see because we're not pure enough, and so forth. And if you were pure enough, you could see these subtle energies, and they have a certain kind of form. They generate certain kinds of emotion or energy, one wrathful and peaceful. Is the feeling component in the Sambhogakaya. The deities have forms, or they take on forms. They don't have permanent forms, but they take on forms. And then now that can, and then you can see in detail. A deity can appear, like in the tantric, and also in your own visualization in infinite detail. They're not out of focus. They're sharp. So the invisible world, has those qualities, but what it doesn't have is the fourth and fifth skandha. Well, it actually has a little bit of the fourth skandha, a little bit of concept, in that the deities, there are different levels of deities, and some of them, very lower levels, there's a kind of conceptual component in them that's just like teachings are revealed. So some of the Dakinis, for example, will give terma, or some of you can go to Maitreya and he recites a sutra for you. that kind of visualization. Well, in that one, there's even a level of concepts. So anything that's kind of heavenly or earthly that's created has some structure to it, and the psychological structure of everything, and everything is in a sense psychological, because mind is always there, um, has some qualities of these functionalities. I think the whole thing is just not appropriating it, or freezing it into our petty personal uh, level, but really just to experience it more at this kind of level of pure energies. And that, of course, again, is kind of a tantric view. We're not dealing with form; we're dealing with energy. And form is just a temporarily fixed kind of energy. And because it's a temporarily fixed kind of energy, it can be reimagined. It can be restructured magically.
When you talk about how he talks about the mandala and how it's almost sound like the five families and how they are really just five things that keep us sane. But then, does he discuss how to deal with the encumbered or the unencumbered aspects of those skandhas? Rather than just, the phrase.
Well, just in the sense that by fixating on stuff and by holding on and grasping, we're encumbering ourselves with the skandhas, and by relaxing and not reacting, developing that kind of non-reactivity, just letting things be, that brings space into the situation. So what we're learning is the kind of situation of whether we fix things or whether we unfix, we let things be open. So it's that kind of opening up, closing down energy that Trungpa wants us to look at to kind of help free us. It was interesting when he said the mandala was very Abhidharma. When you think of the sand mandalas, and you probably all have seen a sand mandala be built by some of the monks who come through, uh, all those palaces and divinities and directions, everything, all the whole metaphysics and cosmology of the sand mandalas is all specified in the Abhidharma. I mean, Vasubandhu has chapter after chapter on that kind of stuff. Where all the heavenly beings, the heavenly places. So in a way, when he said earlier that Tantra and Abhidharma were closely linked, it's that cosmology, that early cosmology that's kind of mythological, that's developed and preserved in these earliest compendiums, that then Tantra will then spring on and this sort of, becomes the palaces of the high deities and such.
A couple questions. One is from when the very beginning, before you started reading, you were kind of going through the five skandhas, and you mentioned conception consciousness is like, you said consciousness was the whole picture. The consciousness is engaging the thing as a whole, and so that really, I think it clarified something for me quite a bit, but I'm going to just double check, so that when he went back to form, and then even he went down to the absolute ground, and then the alaya comes out of that, and he goes to the eight consciousnesses, and then the whole thing is building up, and and the fifth skandha is almost like a external reality, or social. It's like the completed vision of the solidity. Is that where this is all going? It's not. It's not the awareness or rigpa or anything. I mean, it's definitely not that. But I don't,
Well, it's our stream of consciousness, is what the skandha is. It's our, what we call stream of consciousness. So you're Jack Kerouac, you sit down with a bottle of pills and a typewriter and a long piece of paper, and you start streaming out, whatever comes in your mind. And meanwhile, as you're sitting there, of course, Jack Kerouac is kind of being selective. He's got heavy on the story element of it, but as he's sitting there, he's feeling different things. He's taking as much drugs as he did. He's feeling quite a bunch of different things. Meanwhile, he's restless, he's anxious, he's got a lot of energy. He's pretty high. He hears sound from the street. People are out in the room. All sorts of stuff's going on. So that's the stream of consciousness. That's consciousness. It's the moment, each moment where everything, our minds are on the stage. Here we are. Here's our, and that kind of consciousness is got all sorts of things going on. It's got all the skandhas are active, and we're getting all kinds of sense perceptions. We have feelings about those. We're getting our attentions going from this to that. We're having thoughts coming through. We're trying to maintain some sort of thread, usually some sort of agenda, like what am I doing right now? What am I trying to get done? That sort of thing. So all that's consciousness. That's all of that. All happening. That's like I said. That's like you're thrown out on the stage, and you got to, you're in the play at that point. And there's no, when you're in the play, you just gotta be there. You gotta live it out. You don't have kind of the reflective abilities that you might in meditation, where you can sort of individually sort of reflect on or imagine our experience broken out piece by piece in the structural kind of way. But as it happens, it all just one thing, one flow.
all right. Thank you. Makes a lot of sense. Another question I had, I don't know if you want to get into this or not, but in the question and answer, when he says, where does pain and pleasure come from? And he says, they manifest by themselves. They're not dependent on anything. That is the whole point. We don't have to have a chain reaction process. Is this what's he doing there with cause and effect in that?
That's a good question. He's definitely speaking from he said before that the people who developed this had the aerial view. So when he says pain and pleasure are just sparks of energy, that's like the aerial view of it. That cause and effect is a force within the concept. It's a force within the skandhas. It's the narrative kind of drive of the whole thing. As we imagine it, key phrase, as we imagine it. It's not actually, we might say, well, we found out that our partner cheated on us, okay? And then that arrow will say, well, then that caused me great pain. But that's not necessarily always, it doesn't have to happen. You might find that out, and you might give you great happiness because you were ready to get rid of this partner anyway. Now they made it so much easier for you. I mean, they're not unpredictable chain reaction. It could be actually, or this person has been depressed and now for the first time they're happy in their life and you feel some happiness for them. So you can't say for sure, or somebody dies. Well, maybe that, an old person dies. And so that is, but that's good for them. I mean, they're tired of it. They wanted to die. They're praying to die. So, pain and pleasure are kind of conceptual to a large extent. I mean, we kind of fall into predictable patterns, and it's all made up. So in that sense, cause and effect has that kind of, it looks like it's inevitable that because this happened and that happened and so forth, but reality, it's kind of random. And that's what's a little bit disconcerting, actually, is, good people don't always have good things happen to them. Bad people get away with a lot. You don't have to ever answer to everything. I mean, as far as we can see. At a deeper level, everything is shaping your character. So in that sense, you never escape karma. So you have to understand, karma is very subtle. I mean, it's not the outer stuff. The fact that this guy's a crook and he doesn't go to jail, but he's a crook and he has that character. And Trump may never go to jail, but Trump will never escape his slimy character. And he's stuck. That's his karma, is that he's stuck being Trump, and he can't get out of that. And of course, we're stuck being who we are too, unless we've, done some work on that, unstick ourselves. But if you're a person who's not done any work to unstick yourself, whether you get caught, but in the outer world and you don't get caught, or what happens there or not, inwardly, you've corrupted yourself with all that stuff. So how are you going to escape that? You can't. That's the deeper karma of our situation.
Thank you.
Well, we run over a little bit here, so we'll bring this to a close. And next week we'll go on to concept and see what Trump has to say about that. Oh, I just merit male attain the enemy rock during stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death.
In
The ocean
some
are
sort of
like you all breathe. Thank you all for joining.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.